Here's how we're going to fly as usual. I'm going to tell you about our next speaker in January, actually. I'll introduce our morning speaker. Pastor Bob, who you know, will talk about Zoom a little bit and open in prayer. Our speaker will speak because that's what speakers do. And then we'll have a question and answer, and Pastor Bob will close. So with respect to our next speaker, we're not going to have our men's breakfast Zoom in December because it's a very busy time, but our speaker on January the 22nd is a friend of mine, a retired RCMP sergeant who will share with us some of the dramatic incidents from his life. And John Ingalls will join us by Zoom all the way from Manitoba or somewhere else in the world because he may be on vacation. So I'm not sure, nor is he, where exactly he will be hailing from. I've also asked him if he would share a little bit on how he talks to people about the Lord, because he sure has done it very well. So that's January the 22nd, and I know you'll enjoy him. Our speaker this morning, Dr. Kevin Flatt, is chair of the History Department, Director of Research, and the Associate Dean of Humanities at Redeemer University. His research has been covered by all kinds of media outlets such as CBC, Christianity Today, Maclean's Magazine, National Post, New York Times, Washington Post, just to mention a few. And he has a regular column in the magazine Faith Today, which I really enjoy. Dr. Flatt has written at least one book, maybe more, I don't know, but he has a multitude of articles and chapters that he's written. He lives with his wife and his 3 children in his hometown, Kitchener. And we are just so thrilled to welcome him with us this morning. And his topic is What We Believe Matters, comparing the traits of growing and declining mainline Protestant churches, attendees, and clergy. So for a few moments, I'll turn it over to Pastor Bob.
Okay. Well, in a moment, for those who were having trouble getting their mute off, I'm going to mute everybody again. And if you could switch your view from gallery view to speaker view, and then that will just allow Kevin to be on your screen. And if you remain muted, then you won't be interrupting. Then at the end, when he's finished, when we go to our Q&A, if you could unmute yourself, and then we'll be able to hear your questions or your comments, and we can keep on going from there. So what I'll do now is that I will go and I will mute everyone, and then Kevin, you'll have to unmute yourself once we're ready to go there. So there you are. You're all muted. And Kevin, I'm also going to pin you so that you should be the only one on the screen. And shall we come in prayer? Lord, thank you so much for today. Thank you for the broadening scope of these Zoom talks, and how we're international and how other parts of the presbytery are joining in. It shows the importance of what Kevin's going to be talking about today, and the interest in seeing your church grow, for your kingdom to grow, and for more and more people to be able to come in and to experience your love and your grace. As we approach this Advent season, we do wait in hope for you, Lord. Not so much for you to come for the first time, but maybe for some it might be, but for you to reveal yourself in even more and more ways to each of us. So thank you, Lord, for Kevin and his willingness to come and speak to us today. I know that your Holy Spirit is within him, and we ask that your Holy Spirit would be upon him today to give him the words that we need to hear so that you may be glorified, and that in every way we will be able to say, we felt you here with us today, Lord. So bless each and every one of us, bless Kevin, and we look forward to hearing what he has to say. So Lord, in your most powerful and strong name, we say these prayers. Amen. Kevin, it's all up to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much to Murray for the introduction and for setting this up, for inviting me to speak today. And thank you to Pastor Bob for helping with that and for opening us in prayer. And thank you to each of you for being here. You know, we're almost onto 2 screens here, which I feel like in the Zoom world means you've made it. But it's really good to see you all. And yes, it's too bad we can't be together in person. But on the other hand, this means that we have folks here from the other side of the Atlantic. So there are some advantages too. So that's wonderful. Well, I'm going to share my screen so that you'll be able to see my slides. I have, you know, various graphs and charts and things that I want to show you. So I'm going to share that. And hopefully you can see that now. And there we go. And if you find that the video screen of the people in the meeting is kind of in the way, you can click on the top bar there and move that around to get it out of the way, if that's your situation. So my title today is What We Believe Matters: Comparing Growing and Declining Mainline Protestant Churches. And so we're going to be talking about, you know, based on research that I and some of my colleagues have done, and the larger context of research that has been done on this question, what are the differences between growing and declining churches just within the world of mainline Protestantism? And so our focus to a large degree today is going to be on numbers. And, you know, right off the bat, I think we need to acknowledge numbers are not the most important thing about a church. How many members, how many attendees, how much giving, you know, people are often quick to point out, I think rightly, you know, that's not the only thing that we need to be concerned about as churches. And I think that's right. But I do think numbers matter for a couple of reasons. One is numbers can tell us whether we're being successful in carrying out some of the tasks that we have as a church, our task of passing on our faith to the next generation, our task of inviting people to follow Jesus who aren't following Jesus already. Numbers can be an indicator of whether we're accomplishing those tasks. And second, numbers can be a warning sign that something is wrong. Not always, but they can be a warning sign that something is wrong. And in Canada, over the last 70 years or so, there has been some pretty dramatic changes in the numbers facing churches. So if you look at the mainline Protestant churches, and here I'm thinking of the big 3, the United Church, the Anglican Church, and the Presbyterian Church of Canada, this graph just shows if you start in the year 1965 and set that number to 100, what's been the change, the relative change in the size of each of those denominations in terms of the number of members since that 1965 date up until the end of the 20th century. And as you can see, it's pretty dramatic decline. Even just going to the year 2000, these churches lost about 40% of their members over that time. And as none of you probably will be surprised to hear that those trends have continued over the last 20 years since then. So the big churches, these used to be the big Protestant churches. It was something like 4 out of 5 Protestants in Canada belonged to one of these 3 denominations. But not all churches have been shrinking during that time. In fact, there's whole denominations. And here I've picked kind of 3 examples where we have reasonably good membership data. There are also denominations that grew consistently through that whole period. and here we have various different, quite different stripes of evangelical Protestant churches that grew during that same period, doubling or even tripling the size of their membership. So the question is, under what circumstances do churches grow? Under what circumstances do they decline? Some of that has to do with the social environment that we live in, which affects all churches, and there isn't a whole lot we can do about that in the short run. But the fact that some churches have shrunk and some churches have grown in the same time period, in the same country, in the same setting, suggests that also differences between churches themselves can have some impact on whether churches grow or decline. And so a number of years ago, this was back in sort of 2012, 2013, a number of my colleagues, particularly Dave Haskell, who's a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, he was the lead researcher on the study, and then also Stephanie Burgoyne, who's was also a professor at Wilfrid Laurier with an expertise in mathematics. The three of us got together and we decided to look at this question in some detail, but not in an American context where a lot of this kind of research has been done, but right here in Canada. And we wanted to compare the traits of growing and declining mainline Protestant congregations right here in Southern Ontario. So we're not comparing different denominations necessarily here, but we wanted to get churches from within the same group of denominations, some of which were shrinking and some of which were growing, and then compare them to see what the differences were. And we defined growing as sustained growth in attendance, Sunday morning service attendance, over a period of 10 years. So we wanted to see an average of 2% annual growth over 10 years. And we defined declining as basically the opposite of that, sustained decline in attendance of 2% or more a year on average over 10 years. So we really wanted to distinguish very clearly, these are definitely growing churches or definitely shrinking churches, but within the same denomination. So who participated in the study? Well, ultimately 22 congregations, 22 churches, drawn from 4 denominations, the Anglican Church of Canada, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and the United Church of Canada. Those 4 denominations, a mix of those. So 22 churches from those denominations, all in a geographical area stretching from London to the GTA, and some in between. And I think as far north as kind of Aurelia, I think our northernmost church was up in that neck of the woods. Of these, 13 were declining, so shrinking consistently over 10 years, and 9 had been growing consistently over 10 years. And I'll mention here, it was really easy for us to find declining churches for our study. It was extremely difficult to find even just 9 growing churches. Our original goal was to find 10. And it took months and months of looking, contacting everybody we could find who might have some idea of where they're growing churches. Most of the churches that people thought were growing when we examined their records actually were not growing. But eventually we did find 9 that were definitely growing consistently over 10 years in their attendance. We also talked to clergy, and some of these churches had multiple clergy who participated in the study. So we had 29 clergy involved. And we surveyed the congregations. We actually showed up with warning. We got permission to do this. We showed up and surveyed with paper questionnaires the people who were attending these churches. And so we got about 2,200 completed surveys from people attending the churches. And then we did a follow-up. We asked people if they'd be interested in doing a follow-up interview, and just over 200 people did follow-up interviews with us by email or phone. So we got a lot of information about the characteristics of the churches, the characteristics of the clergy, and the characteristics of the people in the pews at these churches. Ultimately, we published 5 scholarly journal articles about our findings. The most important one is the one at the top, called Theology Matters, comparing the traits of growing and declining mainline Protestant church attendees and clergy. That was published in the Review of Religious Research in December of 2016. And we published a number of others just kind of looking at different kind of interesting aspects of what we found, like how far do people drive to get to church? And is that different between different kinds of churches? Turns out it is. How do people make a decision when they're switching churches? What are the factors that influence that? So we looked at a lot of different things, but the main findings came out in that Review of Religious Research article in 2016. And I'll move on, but if anybody wants, the references to look in more detail at our findings, I'd be happy to share those with you as well. Murray mentioned some of the media coverage. Some of you perhaps actually remember seeing the coverage of this study in Maclean's or in the National Post or the Globe and Mail. The Guardian in the UK also picked it up, as well as a bunch of other outlets. So it was nice to see that somebody other than academics took an interest in the work. So as I mentioned, we looked at two things. We looked at the characteristics of the churches as a whole, the congregations. We also looked at the clergy, what the clergy were like, and what the clergy were telling us about kind of their priorities and beliefs and things. And we looked at the characteristics of the people in the pews, of the people who are attending these churches. And we looked for patterns in all of these three categories. So we're not going to have time to get into all of our findings today. And you may be that in the Q&A, you may have follow-up questions about something that I mentioned only in passing, and I'd love to talk about that. But I'll just kind of try to briefly summarize what I think are the most important things for us to take away. So first of all, we found that there were some things that didn't seem to be related at all to growth or decline. The size of the building, the age of the building, the design of the building, even the location of the building. Is it in an inner city? Is it in the suburbs? Is it in a rural location? There didn't seem to be any consistent pattern in terms of distinguishing growing and shrinking churches, in terms of where the church building was and what it was like. In terms of the clergy, their ethnicity, their gender, their marital status, and their educational attainment, didn't seem to be any significant differences between the growing and declining churches. Also, the ethnic makeup of the congregation did not vary very much between the growing and declining. These are mainline Protestant churches in Southern Ontario. Most of them were something like 80% Caucasian, and then kind of a smattering of people of other ethnic and racial backgrounds, but basically the same breakdown between the growing and the declining churches. And I mention this just because sometimes people wonder if some of these things make a difference, particularly where your church is located. Often people assume that is one of the most important factors, but in this group of churches that did not seem to matter. We did find a lot of things that were different and statistically significantly different between the growing and declining churches. The age of the lead pastor, the lead clergy person, and the age of the congregation itself. Generally speaking, the older the congregation and the older the clergy person, the less likely a church was to be growing. But it was a relatively weak association, as we'll talk about later on. So it's not necessarily a big problem for a church to have to be older or to have older clergy people. The presence or absence of recent major conflicts in the congregation. So we found that declining churches were more likely to have had a major conflict in the congregation in the last 10 or 20 years, which makes sense. Often if there's a major conflict, some people leave. So that's not surprising at all. The age and marital status of attendees. The growing churches tended to be somewhat younger on average, not a huge difference, but a noticeable difference. And the people attending the church in growing churches were much more likely to be single and much less likely to be widowed. And you can imagine why that is. The declining churches, because they had older average congregation age in terms of the people attending the church. There were fewer single people because there's fewer young people, and more people who were widowed as their marital status. And so that none of that is very surprising. Now we get into the stuff that's a little bit more interesting, in my opinion. The devotional practices that clergy and attendees engaged in differed significantly. So both the pastors and the people in the pews in growing churches were much more likely to read their Bible more frequently, and were praying more frequently compared to the declining churches. The theological convictions of not only the attendees, that mattered, but especially of the clergy mattered. And I'll explain why that asterisk is there in just a moment. The worship styles were markedly different between the growing and declining churches. In general, the growing churches had somewhat more contemporary and informal styles of worship, and the declining churches had somewhat more formal and somewhat more traditional styles of worship. We'll dig into that a bit later. They also differed, the growing and declining churches differed in terms of what sorts of programs and ministries they emphasized. And I'll say more about that later, but very briefly, growing churches put more emphasis on evangelism and on youth ministry than declining churches did. And there's that asterisk. What we found using statistical techniques is that it's actually the theological convictions of the clergy and the attendees that explained the largest proportion of the difference in growth rates between growing and declining churches. So the most important thing were, what did they believe about various theological questions? And we'll talk about what those were as we go here, but that's kind of behind the title of the talk and the title of our main article, which was Theology Matters for Growth and Decline. So that was the most important single factor that we found, both directly and indirectly, because it influenced some of the other things that were related to growth as well. So there's a lot of information I'm going to dig into in a moment, but what I want you to keep in mind is kind of a simple way of remembering the differences between the growing and declining churches. And that is, we can think of growing churches are like peaches and shrinking churches are like coconuts. Now, I have nothing against coconuts, but for the purposes of this metaphor, I'll explain what I mean here. So a peach, it's easy to get into, right? You can pick up a peach, you can bite into it. If it's a nice ripe Niagara peach, you know, it's soft, it's inviting, it's easy to get in, but there's a hard core at the center. So growing churches are like this in the sense that they have a hard core in the middle, which is that they are very clear about their convictions and their beliefs. And we'll talk more about what that looks like specifically. And they kind of have theological non-negotiables. They say, you know, this is what we're about. This is what we believe. We're not apologetic about it. And we're not going to change those beliefs in order to kind of please people or try to be relevant to the community. However, we're going to try to be as inviting as possible so that it's easy for people to find their way into our church. It's easy if somebody is a teenager in the neighborhood, it's easy for them to get connected with our church. If somebody wanders into our worship service on a Sunday morning, it's going to be easy for them to understand what's going on, and so on and so forth. So you see what I'm saying with the peach metaphor here? There's a hard core of beliefs that they're very firm on, and they're very inviting to outsiders. The coconut is basically the opposite of this. It has a hard outer shell. You cannot pick up a coconut and just bite into it. You'll break your teeth, right? And so the declining churches, they were not very outward looking. They were not outreach oriented. They were not very inviting to outsiders. And this is partly where the difference in worship styles matters, which is that it was much more difficult for somebody who was not already familiar with that tradition to understand what was happening in the worship service. But in general, they were more inward focused in terms of their priorities. But then if you did get into the church, there's nothing in the middle. And what we mean by that, just like a coconut, which is hollow in the inside, they didn't actually have firm theological positions on most issues. So a church like this, they might care a lot about the specifics of the worship style, and put a lot of priority on that, but Do you believe Jesus rose from the dead? Well, that's kind of optional. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. We don't want to offend anybody. We don't have a strong position on that. So keep that metaphor in mind as we move through some of the details here. So starting with differences in program emphasis between growing and declining churches. So growing churches, as you can see here, we asked the clergy, how much emphasis do you put on the following kinds of activities? And we gave them a long list. Growing churches put a lot more emphasis on Bible study. They put a lot more emphasis on prayer group. In fact, shrinking churches put no emphasis on prayer groups. They put a lot more emphasis on youth ministry or ministry to teens. And you can see kind of the numbers illustrated here. So in general, growing churches put a lot more emphasis on opportunities for discipleship and spiritual formation than declining churches. Whereas if you look at declining churches, they were putting a lot more emphasis on social activities. They were putting a lot more emphasis on the music ministry and not as much emphasis on discipleship and spiritual formation. We also saw differences, as I've alluded to already, in worship service styles. Growing churches were more likely to have multiple services, which makes sense just in terms of the numbers. And they tended to have at least one of their services, and sometimes all of their services, with a somewhat more contemporary style and a somewhat more casual atmosphere where the liturgy was a bit more informal. And we also noticed that the attire was a bit more informal. Whereas declining churches, more traditional style of music, much more formal service, and dress, especially of the clergy. Now, I want to just briefly make a side note, kind of an editorial comment here. I love traditional hymns, and I think the liturgy of the church, the historic liturgy of the church, is very important. So this is not us trying to dump on those things. It's simply noting that this was a big difference between the growing and declining churches. And I think partly why this mattered, it's not that there's a magic necessarily to having a guitar in your worship service or to using a video screen in your worship service or something like that. But what it reflects, I think, is that the growing churches had thought very carefully about how do we make our worship services intelligible and accessible and welcoming to people who might not have a background in church or might not have a background in our specific denomination. So one of the growing churches, for example, was an Anglican church. And they were using the Book of Common Prayer to structure even their more contemporary styled worship service. But you could follow along on the screen. You could follow along on your iPad or your smartphone, so that if you were somebody who wasn't used to a Book of Common Prayer type of service, you were not totally mystified trying to flip back and forth between the 4 different colored ribbons in the book and the pew, but you were able to follow along, and there was some explanation of what was happening, so that if you were somebody who is new to the faith or even just new to Anglicanism, you could kind of understand what was going on. So very significant differences there. And I'm already getting into this a bit, but it raises the question, what lies behind these differences in emphasis and style? And a big part of it has to do with spiritual and theological differences. And I want to just look at a few of those. So the first one is that both clergy and attendees in growing churches were more active in personal devotional practices. I mentioned this briefly. They're reading their Bibles more and they're praying more. Why is that? Well, keep that question in mind. We're going to come back to that. So they're more active in Bible reading and prayer. A second difference, spiritual and theological difference, is that churches, clergy, and congregants in growing churches put a lot more emphasis on evangelism and outreach and discipleship over other priorities. They saw their main mission in some way, shape, or form as introducing people to Jesus and making disciples of Jesus. And we got at this in various different ways in our study. One of the things we did is we asked clergy what percentage of their time they spent on different activities, and we found that the clergy of growing churches spent 2 to 3 times as much as a percentage of their time on evangelism and discipleship related activities compared to clergy of declining churches. So in terms of how they were spending their time, it indicated that a high priority for them was outreach and discipleship. And it wasn't that they were spending, 50% of their time on evangelism. I think for the clergy of growing churches, they were spending like 6% or something of their time on evangelism. But that compared to declining churches where they were only spending 2% of their time on evangelism. So we're not talking about huge numbers, but we're talking about very big differences in terms of what the priorities are. Likewise, in our survey, we asked people, this was the one open-ended question that we had in our survey. We asked them, what is the purpose or mission of your church? And they just gave them a space to write whatever came into their head. So we got a lot of very different kinds of answers all over the place. And then we tried to categorize them. We looked for themes. And what we found is in the growing churches, the most common type of response mentioned evangelism in some form. So they said, well, the purpose of our church is to make disciples, or the purpose of our church is to share the gospel with our community, or something like that. So almost a third, about 30% of people in growing churches said that, as that's what our church is about. Only 9% of people in declining churches gave responses that mentioned something like evangelism. In contrast, the most common response in the declining churches was they thought their purpose was promoting social justice, which also was a response we got sometimes from the growing churches. But you could see the difference in emphasis between evangelism versus promotion of social justice between the growing and declining churches. The other thing that was interesting is that there were a lot of people who didn't write anything. And that was more common in the declining churches, which suggests that people in the declining churches were more likely to not really know what the purpose of their church was, or not really to have a good idea of that. And that was actually the most common thing that we saw in declining churches. The most common response where people gave a response was social justice, but it was more common actually for people just not to write anything. So that's more than a third of the people in the declining churches. So what's the reason for that? Well, a part of it is we also ask people about their beliefs. And I'm borrowing here graphics from the McLean's story on this. And they have professional graphics and I don't. So I'm just using the graphics from their website on this. We asked both the clergy and the congregation, we put certain statements to them and asked them, do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? Kind of a spectrum of agreement. And one of the statements that we put to them is, it is very important to encourage non-Christians to become Christians. Do you agree with that? Is it very important to encourage non-Christians to become Christians? As you can see, in the congregation, people in growing churches were more likely to agree with that than people in the declining churches. It's not a massive difference, but it's a notable difference. 78% agreed versus 56%, and that's both strongly agreed or just agreed. The really big difference is the clergy. 100% of the clergy of growing churches agreed that it is very important to encourage non-Christians to become Christians. Most of them strongly agreed with that statement. Only half of the clergy of declining churches agreed that it's very important to encourage non-Christians to become Christians, and none of them strongly agreed with that statement. So that starts to help us understand, why are these churches putting different kinds of emphasis on different things? Why do they have different ideas about what their purpose and mission is? Well, we're starting to get at why this is, and it has to do with their beliefs. Starting with this question of, should we be encouraging non-Christians to become Christians or not? How important is that? And where's the motivation coming from? Well, here, as we dig deeper and deeper, we start to get into really the theology of these churches, which is where the disciple-making motivation comes from. So again, we put various statements to them and asked them to agree or disagree. We asked, this was one statement, only those who believe in and follow Jesus Christ will receive eternal life. Right? That's a tough one. That's a tough one. That's a statement we put to people. And just looking at the clergy, in the growing churches, 77% of them agreed. In the declining churches, only 6% of the clergy agreed. That is a very, very big difference. It's night and day, right? Similar kind of question about, why would it be important to become a disciple of Jesus? We thought this would be an interesting one to ask. Believing Christians have access to real supernatural power in this life that is not available to non-believers. Does it make a difference in terms of access to spiritual power to be a Christian? 77% again of growing clergy agreed. Only 19% of clergy in the declining churches agreed. So is it important for people to become Christians? Well, if you believe that that is the way to eternal life, you're going to think it is important. If you think that you tap into a kind of spiritual experience or spiritual power that you can't have apart from Jesus, you're going to think it's important. So you see the theology is ultimately driving a lot of what's going on in these churches and what's different about them. And so more generally, what we found is that both clergy and attendees in growing churches were more conservative or orthodox in their theological beliefs. Now, I know both those words have a lot of baggage and can be contested. Conservative is the term that's usually used in sociology for the kind of package of beliefs that we're talking about. So we use that term in our publications as well. And it's not meant to have any political implications. So we're not talking about politics here. This isn't, who do you vote for? What do you think about, the deficit? We're not talking about that. We're talking about people who believe, and very often very strongly believe, in the traditional core teachings of Christianity. The kind of things in, let's say, a Presbyterian context that Presbyterians would have believed in 1820 when your church was founded. These churches still believe those things. And we saw that both with the clergy and with the attendees. And that largely explains, we think, the differences in the devotional practices and the differences in the emphasis they put on making disciples, the degree of emphasis they put on that. So I'll give you a few examples, again, using the McLean's graphics here. So here's one of the statements we gave to people. God performs miracles in answer to prayer. Do you believe that? Does God perform miracles in answer to prayer? Well, a majority of both growing and declining church attendees agree with that, a large majority. A little bit more strongly among the growing church attendees. But look at the clergy. Less than half of the clergy of the declining churches believe that God performs miracles in answer to prayer. And almost none of them strongly agreed with that. 100% of the growing church clergy believe that God performs miracles in answer to prayer, and most of them quite strongly believe that. So that's one example of a more conservative or orthodox theological position being more common among the growing churches, especially the clergy. Likewise, here's a tough question. You can ask everybody, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Do you believe in the resurrection? And very few people will say no in a Christian church, although some will. So we did ask them that question, and almost everybody said yes, we agree with that. But then we asked them the tougher version of the question, which is, Jesus rose from the dead with a real flesh and blood body, leaving behind an empty tomb. Are we talking about like a physical, miraculous resurrection where you can put your hand in his side and he'll eat fish on the shores of the Sea of Galilee with you? Or do we mean we're interpreting the resurrection as kind of a metaphor? Well, again, big difference, particularly in the clergy, a slight difference in the congregations, but a big difference in the clergy in terms of almost all of the growing church clergy affirmed the physical resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection. But only half of the declining church clergy did. Here's another one. The beliefs of the Christian faith need to change over time to stay relevant. About half the people in the pews agreed. It's less common in the growing churches, more common in the shrinking churches. But look again at the difference in the clergy. None of the clergy agreed with the statement in the growing churches. A majority agreed in the declining churches. And we've all heard this, right? This is one of the theories of if you want to stay relevant as a church, what do you need to do? Do you need to change your core beliefs or not. And it's very commonly believed, especially in mainline Protestant churches, that really you have to, if you want to keep up to date, if you don't want to fade away to irrelevance, you have to change your beliefs away from things that are out of date or outmoded. Well, so that theory is very common in the declining churches, not among the clergy of the growing churches. Likewise, I don't want to belabor the point too much, and I am getting close to the end here, but I'll just mention a few other differences in terms of views of the Bible. The Bible is the word of God and is reliable and trustworthy. 100% of growing church clergy agree. Only half of declining church clergy agree. And notice that, there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of the specifics still in that statement. But even so, only half of the declining church clergy agreed with that. And so what we get overall, and you probably noticed this if you were paying close attention to the graphs, there's kind of a spectrum of belief that we found in these churches. A spectrum from more theologically conservative or orthodox to the opposite of that, which I think could be described as more theologically liberal or progressive. And I know some of these are loaded terms. We can get into that more later if you like. Where basically the pastors are on the extremes. In the growing churches, the growing church pastors were the most theologically conservative group. The declining church pastors were the most theologically liberal or progressive group. And the congregations are kind of in the middle, but kind of pulled sort of in the directions of the respective clergy. And we think probably what that mainly reflects is that over time, the congregation comes to share many of the beliefs of the people who are preaching to them every Sunday and who are kind of leading the church spiritually. One of the things that we were absolutely shocked to find, and we really would not have expected, is that the pastors of the growing churches, a large majority of them, 79% of them, had attended conservative Protestant or evangelical Protestant churches at some point in their lives, or had participated in the youth ministries or camp ministries or other kinds of parachurch ministries of conservative Protestant or evangelical Protestant churches, versus only 6% of declining church pastors fit into that category. So that may be part of the reason why these pastors are quite different from the other pastors in terms of their theological convictions. So that's just kind of an interesting side note. So sort of summing up what we think is happening, it looks like the conservative or orthodox theology is really the driver of a lot of the other things that matter for growth. So the churches that have conservative or orthodox theology are more likely to have a lot of clarity and unity of mission derived from their theology, which gives them a compelling, distinct message, and frankly gives people a reason to get out of bed on Sunday to come to the church. And again, we can talk about that more later on, what I mean by that. But it also promotes an emphasis on disciple making, right? They believe it really matters. It matters in this life and it matters eternally, whether you're following Jesus or not. And because of their emphasis on disciple making, they have more accessible worship styles that they've thought about, how do we make this accessible to people? And they put more emphasis on certain kinds of ministry, including youth ministry, which is often a good way of connecting with the surrounding community. They would also say, and I'll just put this out there for your consideration, right? We can't prove this using social scientific methods, of course. But so far, these are all kind of human factors. But the people in the growing churches would say part of what's happening is spiritual and supernatural, in fact. So they would say part of what's going on is, frankly, we believe in the power of prayer. And so we're praying persistently. And we think that God responds to that and helps our efforts because we're seeking his help for our efforts. So again, in the world of kind of the social sciences, we don't have a way of measuring divine aid, but just because the social sciences don't have a way of measuring something does not mean that it is not a real an important factor. And the people in the growing churches would say that, in fact, that's part of what's going on here. All right, so summing up, our study found that over 60% of the difference in church growth rates can be explained by four things. Conservative theological convictions, and you use whatever word you want for that, classical, biblical, orthodox, traditional theological convictions of especially the clergy, but also the congregation. Second, a commitment to making disciples as a central mission of the church, something they put a lot of emphasis on that shapes what they do. Making youth ministry a priority, which flows from that, and making worship services accessible for outsiders, which flows from that. So yeah, you can't explain everything, and there are some other factors, and of course there's always things that are more or less random that have to do with very specific circumstances, but about 60% of the difference in growth rates is explained by these four things together. Now, two cautions in terms of what we can do with this information, and then I'll conclude. Number one, truth is more important than growth. You can't simply decide to switch your beliefs to what you think will promote growth, right? So let's say, you know, I was presenting to a church and they're like, well, we don't believe Jesus rose from the dead with a real flesh and blood body. We don't believe that the Bible is trustworthy and reliable. You cannot simply then say, well, we'd like to grow though, and it seems like that's the thing to do, so we're just going to start believing that stuff. It doesn't work that way, right? You can't fake it. What it does tell us, though, is that the message that we have heard a lot since the 1960s, and even before that, and which we have heard a lot, especially in mainline Protestantism, the message that if you have traditional or conservative theological beliefs, you're going to become irrelevant and no one's going to listen to you and no one's going to come to your church. You have to drop the beliefs that intelligent people find implausible. That's just wrong. So you also can't give up your beliefs in traditional biblical ideas to grow. That not only is, again, intellectually doesn't make a lot of sense, although many people have tried nonetheless, but it also doesn't work. So really the question is, you know, what is true? You know, we should be asking ourselves first, what do we believe and why do we believe it? And deciding based on what is true, not on the basis of what is popular. And so ultimately, really the question, the first question before you ask yourselves, how do we grow? The first question you need to ask yourself is historic Orthodox Christianity true or not? And it turns out that matters for a lot of things besides whether your church is growing or not. It has massive implications for everything. So that's caution number one. Caution number two is that updated techniques with the same message don't work. So there are some enterprising folks in churches that are very theologically liberal or progressive who say, well, you know, our problem is not our theology. Our problem is that the evangelicals have better music than we do and flashier techniques, and we should copy their techniques and basically get better at, you know, the style while keeping the substance the same, and then we'll be able to do a better job. Well, I've also done a couple of research studies, again, together with Dave Haskell, looking at this question, and it turns out that that doesn't work. I'll just very briefly give you two examples. One is from a massive advertising campaign that the United Church had in 2006, called the Wonder Cafe advertising campaign. Some of you maybe will remember this. The idea was people need to know what the United Church is about. And our values are very much in line with mainstream Canadian values. We're open-minded, we're accepting, we're tolerant of all kinds of diversity, and we're not going to make you believe anything you don't want to believe. And if Canadians just knew that about us, they'd come to our church. And so they tried to promote the church, that image of the church, and get it in front of more Canadians. So this was one of the magazine ads that they had. You know, it's a Bible with two different colors of sticky tabs, agree and disagree. And then the tagline at the bottom of the ad was, are you looking for a church that's as open-minded as you? Come check out Wonder Cafe and the United Church of Canada. Well, what we did is we showed these ads to a whole bunch of young people and asked them what they thought. And it turns out most of them liked them. They said, oh yeah, you know, this church seems really open-minded and kind of like they would accept me for who I am without me having to change anything. And most of the young people, you know, thought that. And these were people who were not churchgoers. And we said, so would you go to their church then? And they said, well, no, why would I go to church? we already believe all the same stuff. If I go there, they're just going to be like, yeah, you're fine. You know, whatever you think now is fine. So why, I mean, I've got other things to do on a weekend. It seems superfluous. The people who were actually seeking, and there was a smaller number of people in our study who were like, I'm really trying to figure out what's true in life and the world. And they're basically kind of like spiritual seekers. They were just confused. They're like, what does this church stand for? I can't figure out what any of their beliefs are, because all they're telling me is that whatever I want to think is fine. Another example, we looked at a number of different youth events, kind of youth rallies in Southern Ontario, run by very different kinds of churches. And one of them was run by a large United Church in London. They gathered United Church young people from kind of all over Southern Ontario in 2011 for something that they called the Swell. And it was kind of on Good Friday of 2011. And basically, they tried to have an evangelical style event with liberal theology. So they actually borrowed a lot of the contemporary praise music from the evangelical world. They edited some of the words to make them more theologically acceptable. For example, some of you know the hymn "In Christ Alone," a kind of a contemporary hymn. Perhaps you've heard of it. Well, it has a line in there that says, "And on that cross, as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied." They changed that line to say, "And on that cross, as Jesus died, the love of God exemplified." Which actually stops making grammatical sense in the context of the sentence. But basically they're saying, you know, we don't want any talk about substitutionary atonement because we don't believe in that. But we're going to use the songs, and we're going to have like a band, and we're going to do, everything's going to be hip and cool. So we talked to the people at this event. We said, you know, what did you think? Like, what did you take away from it? It failed to make a religious impression on most of the young people attending the event. They're like, the music was great. That was a lot of fun. Nothing spiritual. Whereas the other youth events that we looked at, one was a charismatic Catholic one, one was kind of a charismatic evangelical one. People were like, this changed my life. You know, I had an encounter with Jesus. That was not happening with the young people at the Swell. So updated techniques with the same message don't work. So conclusion, back to basics, I think is how we have to think about this. What do we believe? That's the first question. And as I said earlier, is historic Orthodox Christianity really true or not? Likewise, is the Bible trustworthy and reliable or not? And then the second question, once we've answered the first question, is, so therefore, what is our mission? Are we guided by the Great Commission to go and preach the good news to all nations, making disciples and teaching them to obey everything that Jesus has commanded? Is that the mission, or is it something else? So in other words, is introducing people to Jesus central and training people to follow Jesus, including our kids and teens? And if the answers to those questions are all yes, if disciple making is our priority, do our emphases and programs reflect that it is our central priority? Are we inward focused or outward focused? Are our worship services welcoming and intelligible to people who didn't grow up in the church or didn't grow up Presbyterian or what have you? And are we actually going out there and inviting people to follow Jesus? We know most of them are going to say no. Some of them are going to be offended, perhaps, but are we doing it anyway if it's our top priority? So that's it in terms of what I wanted to share, and I know there's a lot more that we could get into and that we could talk about, and so I would love to hear your questions. I'll stop sharing the slides now so I can see you and you can see each other. And there we are. So I don't know, Murray and Bob, if you'd like me to kind of manage the Q&A in terms of calling on people, I'm happy to do that. So what I would suggest is if you have a question, how about everybody stays muted for now? And then if you have a question, you unmute yourself and then ask your question. And I will see if I can do my best to answer it.
Oh. Okay, Kevin, thank you. And yes, if you want to moderate the Q&A, go ahead. So.
All right. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Any questions?
Maybe I'll pose a question of my own to see, you know, what your thoughts are. Was there anything in there that was surprising to you, or is that more or less kind of what you would have expected?
Yeah,
Doug,
it's not, uh,
Go ahead, Doug.
yeah, the surprising thing to me was that the conservative aspect of religion is important. I'm a member of the United Church, and they're stressing change to try and accommodate, the new generation. Changing, so for instance, we used to have a contemporary and a single service. Now we have both. But your study findings really surprised me that orthodoxy and conservatism are still a major strong point. And I feel that my church is overlooking that.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Yeah, I find people often are surprised to hear that. And our study is not the only one that has found this. Studies that have a good, like, kind of a meaningful measure of this particular issue tend to find the same thing in the US, in the UK. And if you look also, not sociologically in terms of the current or recent situation, but if you look over time through history, at the time of the American Revolution, everybody thought the Unitarians were going to be the future of the church because they appealed to the young intellectual classes, or so it was thought. But of course, it actually ended up being the conservative Baptists and Methodists. The Methodists at that time were quite conservative theologically, who swept the frontier, who won over the population. So this is not a new pattern. It's a pattern that's played out many times over the last 250 years or so.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. I'm much impressed with the depth and thought behind your study.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. And it obviously didn't happen overnight. You
No.
spent many years at it, so I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Flatt, I have a question. Can you hear me?
well,
Yes, I can, Murray. Yeah.
Murray, just before you have yours, Michael was waving his hand, and you're muted, Michael, so you need to. Sorry, Kevin. I said you could moderate, and then I stepped in. So
No, and actually, Bob, I think that might be helpful because when I'm answering a question, I might not notice if somebody puts a hand up or something. So yeah, please do jump in.
yeah. So Michael and then Murray. So can't hear you, Michael.
We can see that Michael's talking and he's unmuted, but we're not getting audio for some reason.
Your microphone may not be turned on. Well, while you're trying to work on that, then Murray, why don't you go ahead with your question, and then we'll come back to Michael.
I was looking at one of your interviews in Faith Today, and as you know, there was a prominent leader of a mainline denomination, and he questioned the role of being a conservative or a conservative theology in terms of promoting growth. And he said, if I've got it right, just to paraphrase, he said, in effect, if how we worship, how we do missions, if it's done clearly, assertively, sensitively, effectively, as opposed to lukewarm and wishy-washy, then it doesn't matter what you believe, whether you're conservative, liberal, or even an unbeliever, there will be growth. And I was interested in your response. I hope I got the paraphrase reasonably close.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. So I think there's kind of two answers to that. I mean, one is, you can think that, but my question is, where's the evidence of that? As a friend of mine says, if we're talking data, let's look at the data. If we're talking opinions, let's go with mine. There were none of the growing churches in our study were at all theologically liberal. compared to the declining churches, which were uniformly theologically liberal. And again, I mean, in terms of like major studies that have been done in other places, or in terms of the historical trajectory of different kinds of churches, I just think the evidence is overwhelming that more theologically conservative churches are far more likely to grow. Now, I think he's right to a degree insofar as any church would benefit from having a clear message, from prioritizing outreach and so on and so forth. I mean, those are helpful things, I think, even if you're a more theologically liberal church. But again, the problem that you run into is, what's the message, and why are you motivated to do outreach, right? So if you don't believe there's anything uniquely special about Jesus Christ or the Bible, and you don't think it really matters whether somebody's following Jesus or is following another religious path or no religious path at all, why does it matter? Why do you want people to go to your church? Like, what message are you going to give them? Like, what are you persuading them to do? It's like if McDonald's decided, we don't care if people eat burgers or not, we're kind of agnostic on the question of burgers. How are you, I mean, what's motivating you? And likewise, what we saw again with the case of those two other studies I mentioned at the end there, with the advertising campaign, which was a very slick advertising campaign. It's the most money a church has ever spent on advertising in Canada. And people were like, yeah, that sounds great. We love that you're so open-minded. But again, why do you want us to come to your church though? Because like, it sounds like you don't believe anything different from what I believe, that you think I should start believing myself. And again, with the youth event in London, it was so striking. We asked at the Catholic youth event and the charismatic evangelical youth event and the United Church youth event, we asked the same questions, what made an impression on you at this event? What are you going to take away from this? And the Catholic and the charismatic evangelical young people were like, I encountered Jesus. My life has been changed. I want to live for Jesus now. I'm going to get more active in my church. The young people at the United Church event said, it was nice to have some good music. It was nice to see my friends. It was fun, right? And nothing wrong with good music and seeing your friends and having fun, but that's not going to motivate people to change their lives, to engage in a path of discipleship, to be involved in their churches. So I mean, again, it's easy to make that claim as a church leader, but I say, where's the evidence and where's the logic to that? I really find both of those things unconvincing.
Mike is on my computer now, so I think you might be able to hear him.
Yeah.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. It makes so much sense. It's not funny. My question to you is, seeing the Presbyterian Church of Canada heading in the direction where liberal theology is going to be the dominating force behind it, what do you suggest to us who want and truly want to serve Jesus Christ in every way possible, knowing that the Bible and the authority of the Bible is going to be stomped on as it has been before? Great presentation for us as an individual church, but as a national church, we're concerned deeply about the direction that it's going. How do you react to that?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michael. Thank you. That's a hard question. I want to be respectful of the fact that I'm, a guest virtually in your church, and I am not a member of your denomination. Although my church is part of the CBOQ, the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec, which is a somewhat analogous, kind of the closest Baptist version of the PCC, and we're asking ourselves even some of those same questions, if you can believe it. My personal take on this, and I mean, I as far as what you think, I want to defer to your context and your pastor and his leadership. But my personal take on this is, it's a little bit like a just war question, right? Are you familiar with just war theory? Just war theory is the Christian tradition that says, you can go to war, but only under certain defined circumstances. And one of the questions you have to ask is there a possibility of success? And if not, don't take up arms. So, one question to ask yourself is, if your church as a whole is concerned about the direction of your denomination, is there anything you can do about it? Or if your presbytery is concerned, is there anything you can do about it? Unfortunately, I'm inclined to think, based on the history of what has happened in the United Church, which is actually where a lot of my research has been, I've studied it very extensively, the odds of success are not good. The structures of the church make change in that direction quite difficult. They put a fair degree of influence in the hands of the clergy, who tend to be more theologically liberal on average than the congregations. And you're dealing with, I would say, and I'm not as familiar with the situation in the Presbyterian Church, with theological colleges that are training ministers that are themselves on balance fairly liberal. So it's very difficult to make those kinds of changes at a denominational or congregational level. And of course, that means if as a congregation you want to, let's say you're a congregation that wants to stay more theologically conservative in a more liberal environment, that's also very difficult to do long term. And I've talked to a lot of folks in the United Church, for example, where there are a few theologically conservative congregations in the United Church, not very many. It's just become increasingly difficult for them over time. And of course, the biggest difficulty is, if our minister retires or moves on, can we replace our minister with someone of similar convictions? And that becomes very difficult to do, because there's very few to choose from, and you might run into opposition from higher levels, from the presbytery or other groups. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. I think it is very difficult to swim against the stream. And so as a congregation, if as a congregation you are concerned enough, really one of the only options open to you is to withdraw as a congregation and find a different denominational home. And there's not a ton of options in that case. And in most mainline denominations, that means losing your property. So it's a tough pill to swallow. But many churches have done it. Anglican churches have done it. United churches have done it. In fact, at the end of the 1980s, there were I think it was about 100 or 200 United Church congregations that withdrew en masse from the United Church and joined the Congregational Christian Churches of Canada, which I think quintupled in size overnight with all the United Churches that joined it. Then, of course, there's the individual level. All of us as individuals have to reckon with this question. Is the church that we're part of and that we're serving in and that we're supporting faithful to the message that we believe is true? And there's no perfect churches, and we want to be part of the solution. But at some point, again, one does have to say, maybe it's just not going to happen for this congregation or this denomination to stay faithful and to find other homes. I mean, there are other Presbyterian denominations, and I don't know what kind of a fit they would be. And again, I'm really I think stepping outside my bounds here as a guest speaker in your church virtually. But those are the considerations, just my personal opinion. There's a lot of really good things happening in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, which has planted churches all over Southern Ontario in the last 2 decades. Again, that may not be a fit, and there may be too many hurdles, but that's how I would be thinking. And I know those are the kinds of conversations we're having in our church, where our denomination recently rejected, in the name of Baptist polity, rejected the idea that we should have a common sort of confessional statement as a denomination that all churches would agree to. That got narrowly voted down 2 years ago at our assembly, national assembly, regional assembly. And as a church, we want to engage with other churches in a shared mission, but there needs to then be a shared mission. And so I'm very sympathetic. In other words, it's hard to be in that situation as a church.
Yeah. Just a question about, I'm finding that a denominational allegiance is shrinking. Just for a fact, in our congregation, we have people who were born into the Presbyterian Church, some in the United Church, some into the Anglican Church, some into the Roman Catholic Church, some into the Nazarene Church, who have some Pentecostals. Um, but all those people seem to have that common um, focus is Jesus, and
Yeah.
so it's um, 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 do you find that is becoming more true within that a denomination doesn't count as much as it is where you're being fed and where you're being where you have opportunities to actually practice your faith?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the case. And you know, it depends. It varies a bit from tradition to tradition. So what we found, this is now almost, of course, 10 years ago, but what we found in the mainline Protestant churches that were in our study is that the large majority of people in each church had grown up in that denomination. And the people who had switched in were mainly, not exclusively, but almost entirely from other mainline Protestant churches. So, in other words, you know, let's say in a Presbyterian church, it would mostly be like 80% or so would be people who are raised Presbyterian, and then the remaining 20% it would mostly be Anglican, United, and Lutheran backgrounds, with a smattering of other things occasionally. Switching has in recent decades has been a lot more common among evangelical Protestant churches. And historically actually was more common. You know, if you go back to the late 19th century in Canada, people changed church membership a lot based on the limited information that we have. It's quite fascinating. But I think it is becoming more common, and I think denominational loyalties are not as important as they used to be. Even to the extent that, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of churches, although they still belong to denominations, don't actually identify themselves primarily with the denomination in terms of what they call themselves. And it's not the first thing you see on their website, for example, which when I was looking for a church, I found kind of annoying because I would have to do a lot of digging to just even figure out what denominational family is this part of, which was important to me. Yeah, so I think in general terms, I think that is true, Bob. I think denominational loyalties are more important still in the mainline Protestant churches than they are in the evangelical churches, but I think that is diminishing.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I have another thing to mention if no one else has anything to say. Stuart.
Yes, I rarely have nothing to say, so I just like to take this opportunity. Dr. Flatt, to tell you that I've enjoyed very much your presentation today. I've enjoyed your research. I took a lot of notes because I was enjoying it so much, and I didn't want to forget some of the important points that you made. And I'd just like to say that certainly I agree totally. The Christian conservative Orthodox churches have a lot to offer, and I can see where a lot of people would not be drawn to a church that wants to present, we'll sort of accept what you want, come to our church, and we're open-minded, and don't worry about the fact that you don't have to accept the Bible, or you don't have to accept Christian orthodoxy, because we just want to make you comfortable, and we'd like for our churches to grow. But you know, my experience has been with the people I know in my circles, and a lot of people that are certainly not church-going people and not Christian people. They're searching for something. They don't necessarily know what they're searching for, but they're searching, and they're discouraged, and they're trying really hard to fill the void in their lives. And I think that certainly conservative Christian churches, I can see why they're growing, because they have a lot to offer. And I can also see, sadly, why those other churches that are just trying to grow their numbers by any means they can, by making it feel good, I can see why they're not being as successful and why they're declining. So your research is impeccable, and it makes perfect sense, and I enjoyed it very much. I must say I'm a little bit discouraged by the fact that you told us that you don't see a lot of hope for some of the ability for those churches that are declining, and even those that are in favor of Christian orthodoxy and conservative churches. I felt sad when you said that it doesn't look that great for turning it around. I believe you, and I think you're accurate, but it's also discouraging, and I wish that there was some way that we could right the ship and turn it around. So thank you very much for your absolutely outstanding presentation and your great research.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, I mean, and I certainly don't want to discourage anybody, but I also want to be realistic. You know, an important thing that we need to remind ourselves is that the decline of a congregation or the decline of a denomination or even the decline of the church in a whole country does not mean the end of God's mission through his people. You know, we in North America and in Western Europe, we talk a lot about church decline, but actually in most parts of the world, the church is growing rapidly. Particularly in places where there haven't historically been a lot of Christians. So God is very much at work. And the other thing that I would say is, you know, things that are impossible, humanly speaking, are not impossible with God. You know, one of the statements we put to people is God performs miracles in answer to prayer. I agree with that. And I think that you know, if we're coming to the Lord, contending in prayer fervently, I mean, that's how revivals begin in history. That's where revival comes from. It comes from the Holy Spirit, and it comes from us asking for it. Now, that being said, again, you know, that's a slightly different question in my mind from should we stay in a particular denomination or should we stay in a particular setting? Because I mean, at some point, you know, if you're part of a fleet of ships and you're on a ship where, you know, a lot of the people running the ship seem intent on poking holes in the bottom of the ship and the ship's starting to go down, you know, eventually you kind of get tired of trying to plug the holes and you just decide you're going to get on one of the other ships where they're not trying to plug holes in the bottom of it, poke holes in the bottom of it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One of the things that I found in your research that confirmed things in my own mind was about clergy, and with me being clergy. I went to Presbyterian College, which in Montreal, for seminary, which is part of McGill, and this was in the late '80s and early '90s, and they had it was in conjunction with the United and the Anglican Church, and so we had a lot of classes together at McGill, and it was very much a very liberal, progressive environment. I remember just before Easter, one time there was probably about 20 of us gathered in the coffee room, and the question came up, was there a physical resurrection? And I was the only one that believed that. And we must have gone on for 2 or 3 hours, just back and forth with us, talking about it. And it was, and the professors that were gathered around us, there was only one that supported my view, and all the others were supporting that it was a spiritual resurrection, or as you said, a metaphor. And so, looking 30 years later, with that continuous type of training that has been going on in our seminaries, I'm not surprised to see some of your research showing that. And what I'm wondering is maybe what we need to do is to have our put more of an emphasis within our seminaries to be able to, because I know the big emphasis when I was there was on social justice, like you said, and I think social justice is good, but if it's not backed up with the orthodoxy, then it's almost meaningless, and that's my personal view. but I could see back then the trend towards the way clergy were being trained in. I had a married student charge at the time, and we were doing a vacation Bible school in conjunction with the United Church in the village where I was at, and they had a student that came from a United Church seminary down in Nova Scotia, and he was sitting at our table while we were planning the vacation Bible school, and he started saying these things, and I remember my wife turning to him saying, "Now don't you dare say any of that to our kids who are in the," and he was shocked.
Yeah.
Because that's how he had been trained in seminary.
Yeah.
And so I think that if things are going to change, that it has to start there, and
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, the if we're going to keep going with the ship metaphor, you know, for a denomination, the seminaries are the rudder,
yeah,
you know, and that whatever direction they're pointing, that's ultimately going to be the direction that the denomination as a whole goes, even if it takes a number of decades,
Yeah.
which very likely it would. And you know, that's very much what I found in my studies of the history of the United Church as well, going back even time before the time of church union in 1925. It's, you know, as go the seminaries, so goes the church.
Mhm.
I don't think, again, you know, not to discourage, but to be realistic and you know, to hopefully prevent you from putting your energies in maybe the wrong spot. I don't think changing the seminaries once they've gotten to that point, I don't think is really possible. You know, unless you're going to have entirely new leadership that's going to totally clean house and get rid of all of the existing faculty and replace them,
Yeah.
which, by the way, has occasionally happened. That's what happened at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And I mean, you're not Southern Baptist, of course, and it's a different world, but you know, that's, so there are a few instances of seminaries that have been turned around, but there's not very many examples, and they only happen under very dramatic circumstances.
Mhm.
I think a better approach might be to start looking for clergy from outside the denominational seminaries.
Mhm.
There are other Presbyterian seminaries that are Orthodox.
Could I ask another question?
I wonder, could I come in, Bob?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but go ahead, Andy.
Andy speaking from the. You said earlier on, Doctor, that one of the encouraging would be to encourage a youth minister, feeling spiritually led to use my spiritual gifts, which I believe was to work with men and to encourage men to come back to church. I've looked at both aspects. I've worked with, all my life with youth under the Boys Brigade movement in Scotland. But later on, when I realised of the spiritual gifts, it was to be working with men and to encourage them. And hence my energies have been spoken. What's your belief and thoughts on that? There was a study done many, many years ago. If you encourage a child to come, you have 1% or 2% of the family will come. If you encourage a mother to come, you may well get 10% of the family to come. But if you encourage the husband to come or the male to come, then you have a 35% more that the family will come with them. So on those bases and those figures that I've been working on.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so I mean, we didn't find in our study that there was much of a gender difference in the makeup of the growing and declining churches, but it does seem to be the case if you look at national and international data, that the declining denominations tend to skew more female. So most in the contemporary Western world, most churches have a majority of female participants, but the proportions change quite widely. So the declining churches are much more likely to have, 70, 80% female attendance, whereas the growing churches tend to be much more balanced, where there are a lot of men present. And there's been a lot of debate as to what exactly is going on there. And I would be misleading you if I said that there was a really clear answer in the research about why that is. But it does seem to be the case that very often, if, like you're saying, the man, the husband in the family encounters Jesus and becomes a disciple of Jesus and starts going to church and participating, usually the rest of the family comes. That's less common if it's the wife and or the kids, as you say. So we do occasionally, there are occasionally instances where somebody, very often if people convert to Christianity from unchurched backgrounds, it's very often in their teens that it happens, rather than somebody who has an established family. But then when the teens convert, it's unusual then that their parents will convert as well. Again, it can happen, but it doesn't seem as common. More than what happens is that then the teens, as they grow up, they marry somebody with similar convictions, and they have a Christian family that is coming to church and following Jesus. But yeah, there is something, appealing to men and connecting with men does seem to be worth giving some time and attention to specifically. And in particular, one does often hear from unchurched men the idea that church spaces feel to them like very feminine spaces, where a guy doesn't fit as easily. And I don't know, we have to be careful not to deal, entirely in stereotypes. And it doesn't mean that, you have to just talk about professional sports every Sunday or something, because some of us don't care that much about professional sports, even if we're men. But there's something to it. And anyway, so it's not a great answer, Andy. I think you're right that it's important. There is something going on there where men in particular have been missing. And how to solve that is another question, or what exactly is going on there, I don't know.
Could I make a comment?
Sure.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Flatt, for coming. I think your data information and analysis is right on. I would recommend your book to others. It's an excellent book. It deals with the United Church in terms of how it has gone down a rather dangerous road, and it's certainly worth reading. One of the things that's important, I think, for us to think about is that the Holy Spirit is very much a part of the church that's growing. Looking at the Great Commission, when Jesus spoke to his disciples just at the end of his earthly ministry, he said, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." It seems to me that if a church is going to plant the seed and have churches grow, right back in the apostles' time, it was the Holy Spirit that gave that possibility, that led it, that gave the power to it, and that has not changed. And if churches are going to grow, or churches are going to, they need to be faithful to the Word and to what Christ taught. And exactly the point that you're making. The role of the Holy Spirit in this is really key.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. One of the limitations of the kind of research that I was sharing with you all is that there are some things that are not susceptible to measurement, right, or to data, or that things that you can't get at very easily in a survey. But even some of the things in our data point to the fact that the churches that are growing are more open to the leading and work of the Holy Spirit in terms of believing that prayer makes a difference, in terms of believing that the one statement that you saw, that believing Christians have access to supernatural power. And of course, what we're talking about there is the power of the Holy Spirit that is not available to non-believers. There's other questions we also, and this gets a little bit more into the weeds theologically, so we tend not to put a lot of emphasis on it, but there was a lot more openness to the manifestation of supernatural gifts among the growing churches as well, compared to the declining churches. Including things like speaking in tongues, which again is not to say, I'm not taking a theological position on that, or saying that speaking in tongues is like, the way to grow your church. But what I think it points to is this larger sense of we're open to the work of the Spirit. And of course that starts with just believing stuff like that the Spirit exists, right? That he exists and that he's active, and that by becoming believers that he indwells us and can work in us. Again, I'm reminded of, and you may remember this from my book, that even going back to the 1930s, one of the principals of one of the theological colleges in the United Church, they were working on a new statement of faith, and he begins his position paper in this little committee that was working on the statement of faith. He begins his position paper by saying, well, of course, the idea of the Trinity is completely out of harmony with modern thinking, so we can't go with that. Well, I mean, you may as well just close up shop, right? Like, what are you doing? It's like, again, to use the McDonald's analogy, it's like saying, well, clearly fast food is a waste of time. So, well, okay, if you believe that, you may as well close the restaurant. So yeah, I mean, it begins with believing what Scripture says and what the apostles taught about these subjects. And then, yeah, prayer. I mean, I think what we can accomplish in our own strength is essentially nothing. Particularly when we're facing the kinds of challenges that all churches face in our environment in Canada. It's a tough environment for anybody. So yeah, prayer and reliance on the Spirit, I think, are essential. Thank you.
Just, if I may, a comment of encouragement. Thank you, Dr. Flatt. That was wonderful. The Baptist Church went through a period of time when there were liberal professors at Acadia University, especially in the training of pastors, but came out from that period quite well, by and large. And so I'm somewhat encouraged by that. There's hope. My question, though, is in your research, did you find a difference in the role of the pastors and the role of the laity with respect to worship and ministry among, of course, declining versus growing churches?
Oh, that's a great question, Marie. We didn't look into that specifically. So we did observe the services. So, when we went, usually the same Sunday that we would do the surveys, we would have multiple members of our research team go to the church that Sunday and just kind of take notes on what was happening. But that's not one of the things I think that was on our radar as a question to ask, how involved lay people were. My memory is a bit rusty now because this was, 7 or 8 or 9 years ago. But I don't remember there being really big obvious differences in terms of, generally speaking, the preaching, and if there was a celebration of communion was led by the pastor. And then there were other elements of the service where various lay people were involved in reading, in leading various kinds of music types of things. So yeah, I don't know off the top of my head if there was a difference there with respect to that question. Yeah, but it's a good question. Yeah, I wish I had an answer for it.
Anyone else? Well, I see that our time is moving on here. If anyone else has a question, otherwise, we'll close in prayer, and I don't see any. So, so Kevin, thank you, and may you feel our virtual hands upon you as we pray. Lord Jesus, we know that when you came at that first Christmas time, that you came in human form, God with us, and we proclaim that, and we believe that.
Yes.
As Paul goes and says in Philippians, that you, in the very essence, God, but you did not see that as something that you were going to promote, and you walked among us in that way until the power of the Holy Spirit came upon you, and you used the Holy Spirit to do the work that you were teaching about and leading us into. You also proclaimed that when the Holy Spirit came, that we would be able to do even more than what you were doing. And we just looked at the multiple ways in which that happens. So we pray, come Holy Spirit, come and fill the hearts of the faithful, and kindle in us the fire of your love, and we shall be recreated. So Lord, we thank you for Kevin and his research and showing us what we believe really does matter. And may we be encouraged, and may he be encouraged to keep on teaching that and sharing that with people. And may you give him many more opportunities in which to be able to share those things. So we do lay our virtual hands upon him in prayer, seeking that the Holy Spirit that is within him would continue to guide him, and that the Holy Spirit that is upon him will strengthen him and give him the courage to be able to continue telling people and sharing with people all these truths. So as we go now, may we as your people take hold of that truth, make it a part of us. Rely on you, Holy Spirit, to be able to do the work that Jesus has taught us to do and commanded us to do. And in every way, may we be a part of your kingdom, but also a part of your kingdom that is growing and growing and growing. So thank you again, Lord, for Kevin and all that he does, and we lift him up to you, as we do with all the people who have been listening today and who will listen in the recorded message going forward. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we come and we bless you. Amen.
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 And thank you for
so much,
including the
everyone.
ladies.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. Ladies are always invited, except when we have our breakfast, and then, things do change. Maybe when we get back to physical breakfast, that might be an opportunity once in a while.
You wouldn't want to watch
Okay.
us eat.
Anyway.
Well, let me just say thank you to everyone. It's been a genuine pleasure to meet you and to spend this time with you. And I wish you God's blessing on your church, on your fellowship, and I hope we cross paths again in the future.
Okay.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Kevin.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.